Thanks, Helen. So I'm Joe. I'm with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. Their Heritage Trust program is primarily where I'm based at, but I do have a decent amount of experience in restoration, ecology, conservation, through my grad work and also working with South Carolina State Park Service. As a biologist there, I worked a lot in trying to promote some of these same restoration principles on state parks in South Carolina. And so I'd like to share with you a little bit about some of the stuff that Victor had mentioned earlier about some of the tools that have come in super handy when looking at how exactly do we manage these vast landscapes that are so dynamic and constantly changing, especially sort of from the lens of trying to promote biodiversity, for example, where we're hoping to improve upon the quantity of species, help sort of promote species that are potentially in decline because of loss of habitat, things like that. So this is a slightly not so normal PowerPoint. So if anybody gets vertigo, let me know. Yeah, as I mentioned, there's a huge amount of useful tools available to guide restoration projects, available to land managers. A lot of them use GIS, Geographic Information Systems, remote sensing, which is basically taking images of the Earth with various sensors, various wavelengths across the spectrum to glean some information about what is on the landscape, what is happening, and documenting the change that happens there. And some of the tools that the Forest Service uses, South Carolina Department of Natural Resources uses, State Parks uses, national parks, all the different land management agencies that sort of exist in this region use some of these tools consistently to help with making those decisions for how to manage for lands. So maybe I'll use this a little bit. So this is sort of a visual example of how diverse just a small area of a theoretical mountain might be. You've got all these different you've got rich cove forests coming down here. You've got pine oak heath, maybe a little bit on a drier site up here. You've got shortleaf pine oak down on the lower elevation ridges. You've got some acidic cove forests down through the valley here, northern hardwoods, high elevation red oak, dry mesic oak, pine oak heath. There's a huge amount of sort of very small ranging in terms of weaving in and out of each other, ecological zones within this southern Blue Ridge landscape. And trying to manage for those has historically been difficult because in order to figure out just how diverse these ecological zones are, we didn't really have a tool for doing that. And now, you can slide a little bit, thank you. So we have modeling. So GIS and spatial modeling is a huge tool to be able to glean some of this information from satellite images, from things like LiDAR, which is a high-resolution way of figuring out elevation and forest structure. And even with all these tools, it's important to remember this is among us GIS professionals, I guess, if you want to call me that. All models are wrong. Some are useful. A model is only as good as the data you put in it, and data is always improving. Models that were made 15, 20 years ago may be vastly different to the same model run with new and improved data today. And this is why a lot of people depend on multiple models to figure out the same outcome. That's why, in an example, we just had a big hurricane come up the coast. When you look at a hurricane model, you have a bunch of different types of models all put together. That's why they call it spaghetti models. Those are all different models using slightly different variables to get at the same outcome. And they all produce different results, which is what that cone of uncertainty ends up being. And somewhere in the middle, you might get something that can allow you to make a decision on whether or not maybe a storm would impact a certain area. So even with all of that said, it is useful to have this information, but no one model is going to be able to predict everything everywhere. So with that, just keep in mind that they always do improve, because as data gets better and better, as collection methods get improved, methods change. It's an evolving process. So land fire is a big one that's been around for a while. Land fire is a group that is between Forest Service and a bunch of the Department of Interior agencies that provides landscape scale modeling products to support planning, management, operations. It began due to an increased concern in the severity and size of wildland fires. And it provides a huge amount of data on the current and sort of potentially historic vegetation conditions across the country. You can keep scrolling. Vegetation and fire regime are some of those. It includes things like average time between fires that could be seen across a landscape under presumed historical fire regime. So, if it was allowed to naturally spread on its own without barriers. How intense those fires might have been, vegetation condition, and departure from historical norms, and reference conditions, as Victor alluded to on successional classes. So this table, I apologize for the font there, but we'll have some of these things posted afterwards if you guys want to review it. So the top row is just an example of some of these reference conditions. That's Southern Appalachian low elevation pine forest. The bottom row here is Southern Appalachian oak forest. Those are some of the two biophysical settings is what they call it. It's basically sort of an ideal condition on a given location for based on the different variables that make up that climate, temperature, precipitation, elevation, slope, things like that. And it'll break out among, not just in one location, but across this entire ecological zone, for example, or biophysical setting, what proportion you would expect to see under normal fire conditions. Consider of early successional species, early successional stage, mid-successional, and late successional, open and closed. So there's you can see there's a big difference here between the two that we were talking about that are fairly common in this area, the oak forest and the low elevation pine forest. You can see there's a 34% of low elevation pine forests would have been considered early successional, whereas only 5% would have been in Southern Appalachian oak forest. However, as you see, it also has 30% mid-successional, 30% late successional. And in oak forest, same thing. It's 35% mid-successional, a little bit smaller, late successional, 25%, and both have sort of similar numbers on the late. And they also have information about severity of fires, overall frequency of fire. So with the Southern Appalachian low elevation pine, you can see that's a mean fire return of an average of potentially 3 to 5 years is usually the rule of thumb in some of the lower areas, and then it increases the higher you go up, 15 years over there in the oaks. And the percent low severity fires is what dominates both of these settings. So 84%, 88% is in general what types of fires would have happened across this landscape. So it's comprehensive. It goes into dozens and dozens and hundreds of different settings across the country. But being a national data set like this, it is really primarily suited for landscape level planning. They actually admit themselves that they have known limitations in certain things. Validation is difficult. In our region, for example, Southern Appalachian oak forest, which is one that is described as a dominant biophysical setting in this area, has a known issue that they say some drier xeric sites may develop substantial pine component of shortleaf pitch and or table mountain pine. Depending on location and elevation, these would be examples of southern Appalachian montane pine forest and woodland or low elevation pine forest. So there's an identified known issue error with the data set, basically meaning that a lot of areas on this forest, we can't necessarily rely solely on this data set to get at what we're looking at. And this is true of, a lot of this area across the southern blue. DNR has a property called Jocassee Gorges, many of you are probably familiar with. We have a lot of land out there that we're trying to do some similar management practices as the forest in terms of restoration. So we're looking at the same data sets for those properties. So ecological zones come in, as I mentioned before, as a localized product. So this is a really great fine scale, high definition, derived from LiDAR, as I mentioned earlier. This is a 10 by 10 foot resolution model. This is the fourth time that this model has been rerun by the same contractors that were hired to develop this. They've done it for several different regions across the southern Blue Ridge, and it gets at a much more localized view of what is thought to be, appropriate out here. So we can keep going. Just a few quick stats here. We've got, with models, as I say, how do you validate a model? How do you know it's good, right? So we've got, in this data set, over 2,200 reference sites where someone actually went out to that location, compared the model with what's on the ground, which is an increase of 1,500 sites compared to the first time that this iteration, this model was actually done. So a huge more amount of field validation went into this. Big jump. 24 computer-generated environmental variables were used, including things like, and they were mostly elevation, like aspect, slope, geology, precipitation, solar radiation, terrain. All of those went into this model. And again, the output is at a 10 by 10 foot resolution, so very, very small area compared to the original one, which was at a 30 by, well, actually the original one was 100 foot squared, 10 times larger. And then the second and third, I believe, were 30 foot. So yeah, what is an ecozone? Just a quick definition. They describe this as a unit of land defined by all these models that support specific plant communities based on factors such as the things I described earlier. And they may or may not reflect existing vegetation, but instead vegetation that could occur on a site with historical disturbance regimes. And that also takes into account, current hydrology, for example. Maybe water availability is not the same as it was historically. So if something historically was something that required more water, but today that's not there, it may give you some other information about that. So just talking about resolution, I mentioned the earlier talk, the earlier model was a 100 by 100 foot resolution. This is some sample output of the Ecozone model. I focused on some specific zones that we're talking about that are more drier sites, fire adapted. And this is a 10 by 10 foot resolution. And as an example, a 100 foot resolution turns into something like this. So you can vastly overrepresent or underrepresent these zones based on the resolution of the data. It's pretty dramatic, even with just that 100 foot to 10 foot difference. And then, just to compare, this is an area of the southern Blue Ridge called, and this is from data. This is from a collaboration, the Ecoregions project, which is a collaboration between NRCS, EPA, USGS, all these different organizations to sort of unify national general broad classifications. So that green area, you can see the blue lines here. That's the Pickens district. And the green area is what you'd call the southern crystalline ridges and mountains, which includes a lot of historic ecoregion or ecological classifications like the Forest Service's own Bailey's survey. It includes a lot of those same areas. So this vegetation includes Appalachian oak forest, northern red oak, white oak, chestnut, pine oak, heath woodlands, all these different ecozones inside of this one large area. It also states that early successional sites dominated by grasses, as Victor alluded to, shrubs, seedlings, saplings, fruitiferous tree species are also included in here. So this is a general makeup of our southern Blue Ridge escarpment zone that the model was done on. It includes all of the Blue Ridge area of South Carolina, and it goes a little bit into the North Carolina and northern tip of Georgia. 30% of the land was expected to be somewhere in the, I believe it was the Appalachian oak. What is it? The dry music oak hickory forest, and then 19% of it shortleaf pine oak heath woodland. This is the definition again, but just to keep in mind, South Carolina occupies much of the lower elevations within this escarpment, so therefore 70% of the shortleaf pine oak ecological zone is actually in South Carolina. And that's 50% on private, 20% on public and state. So what do they look like? We've touched a little bit on this, but these are some examples from the report. We've got, you can probably take control again, sorry. We've got shortleaf pine oak on the Sumter National Forest here. This is the Otter Creek area. This is what a shortleaf pine oak forest in its current state might look like. This is the sort of area that you can keep scrolling as we go here. Ashmore Heritage Preserve, this is a DNR property that had Persimmon Ridge area, similar thing, shortleaf pine oak woodland and forest. Pine Oak Heath, Buzzard's Roost Heritage Preserve, also DNR property adjacent to the forest here. Similar things, this red area, sorry, that red is shortleaf, and then the green area is dry oak or pine oak heath of some kind, and then there's actually the color's a little off. There's supposed to be an orange spot there that's pine oak heath, but keep going and we might be able to see some more of that. Yep, here. So this area is all orange. Jocassee Gorges, similar stuff. South Carolina DNR. Keep going on. And all of this is from that 10 by 10 foot resolution model. We've got Caesar's Head State Park. This is a view from the Cold Spring Branch area running down to Jones Gap there. And all of these ridges have that dry oak deciduous heath validated data there. Dry music oak forest near the Green River Gamelands. Now you're getting into sort of a little bit higher elevation, Piney Mountain area. And so those are just a sampling of some of these larger sites. All right, I'll take over again. I apologize. This is a funny thing. So how accurate is it? Errors associated with any model, 87% is what the overall accuracy is. 87% is accurate within the shortleaf pine oak woodland type, 79% overall, which is on par or better with the data sets that are used across the southern Blue Ridge for this similar stuff. To compare, the second approximation had 52% accuracy, and the first only had a 36. So this is a much larger improvement than on what the original data 15 years ago said. Highly driven by elevation, relief, precipitation, and water availability. So just so we can check out the data a little bit, this is the output based on the Sumter district where we're at now, Andrew Pickens district. We've got all of this area. The red, like I said, is predicted for shortleaf pine oak woodland. Brown is pine oak heath. Green is deciduous and evergreen heath, oak heath. Gosh, they all sound the same when you keep saying them over and over again. And notice there's a few. We talked a little bit about the white pine restoration areas. Some of these, the colors kind of not showing up very well, but if this is sort of the gradient when you get up into the Ellicott Rock area, when the elevation changes a little bit, the ecozones change a decent amount, and a lot of all of the white pine restoration areas are based in the areas that are designated below that. So it doesn't get into some of these other ecozones as much. So running through a couple examples, here's a couple boundaries for some of these white pine restorations. So in these sites, the desired future conditions listed by the, sorry, I'll just stay on here. So it was listed as dry upland forest cover type, such as shortleaf pine and oak, 1 or 2 story canopy, open to closed, and the sort of treatment is even age regeneration is what's going to happen. So, so if you look at the model, in those areas, you can see it lines up almost perfectly with the ridges, and the majority of those predicted ecozone types are shortleaf pine oak, with some supplemental dry oak evergreen and dry music oak. Another example, just to kind of compare and contrast, this is an area where we've got 2 separate ones. There's on the southern side, you've got the same area where we're looking at shortleaf pine oak, 1 or 2 storied open to closed canopy with even age regeneration. The northern area in orange is white pine forest cover. The future condition is considered to be, they want it to be white pine forest cover with mixed type and other mesic species, multi-story canopy, uneven age regeneration. When you look at the models, you see it is a mixed ecozone stand. There's a bunch of different things happening in here. You got some wet areas, you've got some dry areas, and all of those are mixed within some of the pine oak and some of the oak hickory, and it's mixed. So they're going to be managing it for that according to the model. It's much more fine scale. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, a general sort of overview of the data and how it's used. Multiple agencies in South Carolina are using this to guide not only forest management in terms of how to, chop timber, or how to, do timber harvest and things like that, but also for prescribed burning, where to burn, what areas are appropriate for burning. But it's also important to know about these, I'm just going to, since I'm a natural heritage guy, I had to throw in a few things about endangered species. They'll be a little bit later. But there's a few things that, need these early succession habitat that is sort of missing from the landscape right now, including Goldenwinged Warbler. So they are under review currently for federal listing status as an early successional specialist species. Their habitat is shrinking. They require shrubby habitat, upland wetlands, sporadic tree cover, grass forb understory. A lot of the stuff that we're trying to get back into the landscape up here. Nests in disturbed areas and early successional habitats are short-lived, and in many places are forcing these birds out. So this is why they're being considered for listing. You can keep scrolling. We actually, DNR has just been approved for a project that is going to look at the populations for this species and ruffed grouse, another species that needs some of these different successional classes in South Carolina, and sort of monitor, survey where these things are occurring now, determine whether or not they're declining, and use a few other species that are indicators of early successional habitat along the way, like prairie warbler. You can keep going. Georgia Aster is another one that sort of occurs on the lower elevation areas. There are some on the district here. They are a federal candidate species and are found in 14 Piedmont and mountain counties in South Carolina. They're considered a relic of the oak savanna prairie communities. We talked a little bit about savannas and prairies earlier. They're just maintained by fire disturbance, and this is another species that would benefit greatly from a lot of this management. You can keep going through here. And lastly, just wanted to talk about smooth coneflower, which is a currently listed federally endangered species of flowering plant. Very pretty. Some of the largest populations across its range are on the Andrew Pickens district or nearby in lower elevations, and they are typically found in these, they're found along roadsides and rights of way because the habitat that they would require in the forests are not as predominant. So, managing for species like this and as a healthy community overall is really great. So with that, I believe I am finished. Yes. Did I make it? Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks.